So get this, only 21% of Canadians still have a positive view of the US. That's not a rough patch, it's a total relationship collapse. Canada just changed its status to seeing other countries.
And it's about to get much darker. While the US calls us freeloaders, they are quietly starving out our favorite travel spots like Cuba. Is this a coincidence, or is it a calculated pressure zone?
Today, we're exposing why Canadians now fear Washington more than Russia and the massive double standard keeping the US in the Olympics while they treat the hemisphere like a war zone.
And listen, this is not an anti-American people rant. This is a Trump administration rant. Dave and I have traveled the US for years, and some of our best friends live there. This is a very specific conversation about power that keeps treating Canada like a disposable extension cord.
So let's start with what changed. The Angus Reid numbers are in and they're brutal. 21% favorable towards the US overall. 22% still willing to call them an ally. And 69% saying deal cautiously or this is a potential threat.
In another poll, almost half of Canadians picked the United States, not Russia, not China, as the biggest threat to world peace.
While only 29% said Russia. Let that sink in for a minute. The country with the massive nuclear stockpile on our border is now seen as a bigger problem than the one we grew up being warned about in Cold War documentaries.
So when people say potential threat, they're not being dramatic. That is genuinely how Canadians are ranking the danger now.
Which is absolutely wild when you remember that just a couple of years ago, 3/4 of Canadians were still in the, yeah, they're our ally column. Now, the majority are basically saying, you keep calling us weak, freeloaders, a 51st state? Well, fine. We're done pretending that you're a friend.
And at the same time, 2/3 of Canadians want Ottawa to take a hard line in trade talks, even if it strains the relationship.
Canadians are looking at tariffs, threats to rip up Kuzma, talk about absorbing Canada, and they're saying, okay, you're not our friend anymore.
And we see that reflected not just in Canada, but around the world. Poll after poll has countries ranking the United States right up there with Russia and China as one of the biggest threats to global peace.
Travel to the US has fallen off a cliff. Canadian trips to the States dropped more than a third in 2025 compared to the year before. Border crossings by car are down, flights are down, and New York State alone has seen a 21% plunge in Canadian visitors.
Yep, Canadians aren't just grumbling about Trump, they're voting with their wallets and their passports. Canadian car trips to the US are down nearly 40% compared to before the tariff war, and they continue to drop. US data shows roughly 4 million fewer Canadian visitors in 2025 from the year before. That's a drop of about 22% in a single year. Border crossings by car are down almost 20% in 1 year. And in December alone, Canadian trips home from the US by automobile fell 30% compared with the year before.
Yeah, that's not an abstract chart for people up here. It's actually heartbreaking. We've got friends and family there. We had annual trips, winter escapes, conferences we look forward to every single year. And now more and more Canadians are saying this, I don't feel comfortable going to a country whose president is threatening us every other day.
And remember, even with that drop, the numbers are still propped up by the people who don't have a choice. Cross-border workers, families caring for relatives, students, truckers. Our countries have been stitched together for decades. So when you see a 20+% fall off, you can't just shrug and say, oh, that's not much. For a place that has felt like a second home to millions of us, that kind of cutback is huge.
Yeah, air travel is also down. Government numbers show 7 straight months of decline in 2025. At the same time, trips to Europe, Mexico, the Caribbean, they're all up. So Canadians didn't just get mad, they changed their booking patterns. They chose different beaches, different city breaks, different airports. And that is what Washington never seems to understand, or they just ignore. If you keep threatening your neighbor eventually finds another route.
StatsCan says trips from overseas are now above pre-pandemic levels, and domestic travel inside Canada is up more than 10%. Many provinces had a record number in 2025. So, Canadians, we're still traveling, we're just not going there.
And it's not just us. Global travel hit record levels last year. Most big destinations are growing, but the United States, it is one of the only major tourism economies where international arrivals and spending are actually going backwards. And they flat out admit that fewer Canadians are the main driver of that. Florida, California, New York, they're all reporting double-digit drops in Canadians alone. The rest of the world is crowding airports, and Trump's America is a place people are quietly crossing off the list.
So Canadians start looking elsewhere, with Mexico and Cuba being high on our lists. But now look at the hemisphere map. Cuba's in the middle of a full-blown fuel and economic crisis because of Trump's fuel embargo and tariffs aimed at any country that tries to ship oil to their island. Their energy grid is running on literal fumes.
When you cut off fuel to an island, you don't just hurt a government. You hit hospitals, food distribution, power, families, children's basic daily life. You make sure the lights don't come on and the buses don't run. That is collective punishment with actually extra steps.
And now, under pressure, Washington has opened the tiniest release valve. The U.S. Treasury just quietly said it will let companies apply for licenses to resell Venezuelan oil to Cuba's private sector to help with the fuel crisis it created. So they slammed the door, pushed the island into blackouts, then cracked it open a few millimeters and called that mercy.
And Trump isn't even shy about it. He's on camera bragging that he's the one controlling the fuel. So the same guy who cut it off is now handpicking how a trickle gets turned back on.
Luckily, other countries are trying to clean up a fraction of the mess. Canada just pledged $8 million in food aid for Cuba, routed through UN agencies so it actually reaches people on the ground. Mexico has already sent more than 2,000 tons of beans, powdered milk, and basic supplies by Navy ships. It's decent, it's needed, but it shouldn't be necessary in the first place.
And for us, this is personal. We were last in Cuba just before Trump's first term when the Obama thaw was in full swing and Havana was finally breathing again. Streets were packed, restaurants full, people were hopeful. We walked through old Havana at 2 in the morning, live music pouring out of doorways, families in the plazas, and felt perfectly safe the entire time. It was one of the warmest, most welcoming places that we'd ever visited.
And that's what gets crushed when Trump brags about controlling the fuel. He's not just squeezing a government, he's stalling a country that was finally starting to stand up again and driving it back into the blackout and food lines because it plays well in a campaign speech.
So when a Canadian poll says, "We fear Washington more than Moscow now," that doesn't come out of nowhere. That comes from watching behavior.
And then there's Mexico. In the latest Pew polling, about 2/3 of Mexicans say the United States is the #1 threat to their country. And Canadians look at that and we go, yeah, that sounds familiar.
Canadians were already choosing Mexico and Cuba as alternatives to U.S. vacations. Now, suddenly a cartel war breaks out in Mexico, and Cuba ran out of fuel, so Canadians are being forced to look elsewhere again. Well, newsflash, Florida, it won't be you.
And that brings us to the big symbolic question that we want to talk about. The Olympics. Because nothing exposes hypocrisy faster than a giant global event wrapped in a peace speech.
Right now, Russia as a state is banned from the Olympics. Instead, individual Russians and Belarusians can compete only as individual neutral athletes.
Now that's a serious penalty, and you can absolutely make the case that Russia earned every inch of it with their invasion of Ukraine. We have no problem with Russia being banned for its invasion.
The issue is the standard. If the supposed rule is you can't invade, destabilize, or collectively punish countries and still get the full Olympic treatment, then why does the U.S. escape any structural consequence at all?
This is the same White House that invaded Venezuela and abducted its president. Trump is so proud of it, he literally shared a fake Wikipedia page calling himself acting president of Venezuela, while bragging that the U.S. will run the place and pump its oil for years. All for control of their oil and to take Trump one step closer to his Don Road doctrine to control the entire Western Hemisphere.
And at the same time, Washington has choked off fuel to Cuba, pushed that island into a full-blown energy crisis, dropped bombs on Nigeria on Christmas Day, and is lining up war talk and carrier groups off of Iran.
And on top of that, he's still talking about taking over Greenland and turning Canada into the 51st state.
And Canadians see that double standard. The same Canadians are watching Russian teenagers compete under a neutral flag, while the country that starves an island keeps its anthem loud and proud, and Israel, whose prime minister is literally wanted by the ICC for war crimes, marches in under its flag with full honors.
And just to be crystal clear, we are not saying ban the athletes. The skaters, the sliders, the skiers, they're not the ones signing arrest warrants or ordering airstrikes. But if the rule is that a state's behavior can get downgraded, neutralized, or kicked out, then you don't stop at Russia. If your prime minister is under an international arrest warrant for war crimes, or your president is a convicted felon and is invading neighbors and blockading fuel to civilians causing a humanitarian crisis, that should trigger the same standard.
At the same time, Washington is pouring money into a network of giant migrant detention camps. Human rights lawyers and historians are literally calling them concentration camps, and they're right to be alarmed. And when they don't even want people on U.S. territory at all, what do? They ship them to El Salvador. Hundreds of Venezuelans have been dumped into CCOT, a mega prison where there's no visitation, no recreation, no education, just indefinite lockup under a deal where Washington literally pays Bukele's government to hold them.
Most of those people don't even have criminal records. They're asylum seekers and migrants who vanished into a foreign jail because Trump wanted them off the map.
Then back home, they're sending National Guard troops and even Marines into their own cities to police immigration protests and mass deportation crackdowns while murdering their own citizens.
And yet, this is still the country set to co-host the World Cup this summer and the Olympics 2 years later.
When you hear people say the U.S. should be banned from the Olympics, they're not saying Russia should be left off the hook. They're saying if the price of breaking the basic peace is losing the privilege, then apply that price fairly.
Meanwhile, Canadians are quietly doing the one thing they can control. We're changing where we spend our money, where we travel, what we buy, and we're changing who we call an ally.
But let's not miss the most hopeful part of that Angus Reid poll. Canadians are not just sour and scared, they're also clear about what they want their own government to do. Hard line on trade, caution on security, more independence in foreign policy, and a prime minister who isn't waiting for approval from Washington.
That's why Carney's numbers are so high. People see someone actually willing to say, no, we're not signing that, and no, we're not pretending this is fine, and they've rewarded it. In the latest Angus Reid polling, about 2/3 of the country say Carney is doing a good or great job on the U.S. file, and roughly the same share approve of his overall performance as prime minister.
So where does that leave us as Canadians and as travelers?
Well, first, we have stopped pretending that this is a phase. When 40% of Canadians think the U.S. is the biggest threat to world peace, that is not going to be fixed by one nice speech, a midterm election, or a handshake and a photo op.
Second, we get serious about alternatives. Rail links, port deals, direct routes to Europe, Latin America, and Asia that don't all funnel through American territory. And Carney is doing that just this week, mending relationships with India and building stronger ones in Japan and Australia.
And third, we need you to remember that this isn't about hating ordinary Americans. Regular people down there are also trapped in a system that they don't control, and they are just as upset or more with what is going on.
And finally, we stop underselling our own country. Canada is not a side character in somebody else's story, no matter what MAGA tries to say. We're a G7 economy, a founding NATO member, the only non-EU country and safe, a resource powerhouse, and yes, a serious middle power that other countries want to work with because we're not endlessly threatening to blow up other economies.
Let us know in the comments, are you part of the 21% still optimistic about the USA? Or the 79% who are done pretending that everything is fine and they are no longer an ally?
And if you've already rerouted your own travel plans, tell us where you're going instead.
Check out the Planet D Travel for ideas. We have videos from our 20 years of travel around the world going up regularly. The link is in the description below.
And if you want to go deeper on this, we'll have the charts, the links, and the extra rants over on our Substack, and the link to that is down below as well. And as always, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell if you haven't already. And drop this into whatever group chat is currently stressing you out.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and we will see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.